What's metabolism? Yeah.
It's kind of the process of getting energy from the substance you get from your food. Like,
Okay.
it's the process of how to break down like carbohydrates, fats, proteins.
Exactly. Okay. Metabolism is deriving ATP, deriving energy from some other what we're going to call a substrate. And that substrate is carbohydrates. So it could be glucose, fructose, galactose, sucrose, whatever it is. All the things that get this big dopamine release in our brain that I love so much. Okay. It could be from fat. It could be from protein. It is not always, but that kind of a thing. All right. The importance of metabolism during exercise is what? Why do we have to care about metabolism during exercise? Or during physical activity? What am I doing right now? Am I exercising? I'm doing physical activity, right? What's happening to my metabolism as I walk? That's one of those Mondays. Okay. Shall we squat until and do metabolism that way until somebody wants to answer? No? Okay. Increase. Good, thank you. Okay. I exercise, metabolism goes up. So what we're going to talk about, okay, today is going to be what are some of these pathways? How are we going to supply the energy that we need in order to be able to actually go through and continue to make ATP, continue to run the cross-bridge cycle, continue to resequester calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and continue to repolarize our neurons and sarcolemma so that you can continue to exercise. That's the point, okay? That's going to be the point. So, on this particular slide, many of you commented on that I will talk about things and then just sort of blow through some slides, where the things that I talked about were. Fair enough. I noticed that I do that, all right? So, this is the idea of potential and kinetic energy, okay? As I move, this is not exactly the most accurate way to do this, but as I'm moving, I am using kinetic energy. I'm making ATP, I'm breaking it down, I'm making some more, and it generates sort of motion, okay? That's kinetic energy. So when you're exercising, when you're just being alive, you're using kinetic energy. Potential energy is, think of potential energy as this is what you store, okay? Whatever you ate for breakfast, okay? Whatever you have in glycogen in your muscles, in your liver, okay? All of the things that I have in this, my flabby tricep, okay? Subcutaneous adipose tissue, all of that. That's potential energy. It's not been realized yet, but it's there, okay? But it's there. And so what we're going to do then is basically work on this idea of biosynthesis or work on this idea of sort of biochemistry in that bound energy in one substance transfers directly to the other. I have energy stored in my muscles in glycogen, or there's energy in a glucose molecule. I'm going to break it down and I'm going to then make ATP. I'm going to transfer it from one place to the next to allow me to continue to exercise. That's what we're going to get at here. Okay? That's what we're going to get at. Nope, not wanting to go. Seriously? There we go. So, for this particular slide, we can talk about chemical, mechanical, and transport work. This is just a way to describe what are we using ATP to be able to do. Okay? Sometimes we use ATP to transport things. We call this active transport, right? You're moving things against their concentration gradient. Okay? We can make new things, that's chemical work, and then mechanical work is one. I'm not going to ask you guys a question about all of this. I just want you to see these terms. I want you to understand, just very, very, very generally that this is the way that we try to classify it. Okay, that this is a way to classify what these things are. We talked about this a lot last week. Okay, we talked about ATP. We talked about the fact that you have very small amounts of ATP in your muscles. Okay, very, very tiny amount. Okay, everybody raise your hand up over your head. All the ATP in your delts gone. Okay, you can put it down. Okay, all it takes is that, and the stored ATP is all gone. Okay, it's a tiny, tiny amount. Okay, so the rate that we use it depends upon exercise intensity. Exercise intensity essentially is force production. Okay, so the higher the force, or the longer we need the force, the more ATP we're going to use. Its rate of use varies between fiber types, right? The myosin ATPase is more or less efficient and goes faster based upon fiber type. Okay, fast twitch fibers use more ATP to contract and relax than slow twitch fibers. Okay, that's important. Very, very low. How are we going to get more? This part at the bottom, this is the entire idea of metabolism. Okay, you use it up, and yet you were able to continue to hold your hand up over your head. So we're making more ATP from somewhere. Okay, from somewhere. There are going to be several pathways. We'll talk about a couple of them today. And there may be several substrates. Okay, maybe it's coming from carbs, maybe it's coming from fat, maybe it's coming from protein, maybe it's coming from creatine. Okay, I put this here, and this is part of what makes metabolism tricky. The pathway that we use to derive that extra energy once you burn it up is going to vary based upon how are you exercising. Okay, are you walking or running? Are you biking? Are you lifting weights? Are you on the elliptical? Okay, whatever it is. It really depends upon the intensity of the exercise. How much force do we need? But it also depends upon, is there oxygen? And usually there's oxygen. Okay, but sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's not. Okay, your state of training. Are you well trained? Are you not very well trained? That affects things. Now, think about that, but it does. Okay, we'll get into the why. And then your diet. It also depends upon what you've eaten. Those of you that have eaten breakfast, depending upon what that breakfast was, will be using a different pathway, or maybe at least a different substrate to make ATP right now compared to people that didn't eat breakfast. Okay? If I feed you carbs, you're going to use carbs. If I feed you fat, you're going to use more fat. Okay, this is going to become important as it relates to diet before exercise and whatnot. Okay, I know you guys have all had nutrition. I know you've all had nutrition. So we're not going to dig into a lot of the things as it surrounds carbohydrates, fats, and protein. But I'm going to need to be able to talk about those things as it relates to what is our metabolic substrate. Which one are we using, or which one is the predominant one that we're using at a given time? Okay, so when we talk about carbohydrates, the example molecule that I'm always going to use is glucose. Okay, is glucose. You guys eat lots of carbs that are not glucose. Okay, but the process is basically going to be the same. So when I talk about carbs, I'm going to talk about how we break down a glucose molecule, but the same thing would happen generally if it's fructose or sucrose or maltodextrin or whatever, because those things don't just get turned into glucose. Okay, the glucose is the molecule. We store glucose. All of you store glucose both in your liver and in your muscle. Okay, in your liver and your muscle. We're going to use those carbohydrate stores in glycogen. Okay, it's called glycogen. Did I say glycogen? You have liver glycogen, muscle glycogen. We use liver glycogen primarily to maintain blood glucose level. maintain blood glucose. Okay? If you have not eaten breakfast yet today, you are likely breaking down more liver glycogen than somebody that did. We're not going to get into the mechanisms or any of that at all. But the primary thing is that as blood glucose gets used up, by brain, by muscle to some extent, the liver breaks down its glycogen to exactly match whatever's being taken out. Okay? That's how we maintain that, because you have to have a certain amount of blood glucose. Muscle glycogen, on the other hand, just exists to be used by the muscle. Okay? You can imagine when I start to exercise, and especially if it's high intensity exercise, I will begin to break down muscle glycogen. I will get glucose from muscle glycogen, because then it doesn't have to go anywhere. It's in the muscle, break it down, it stays in the muscle, throw it into glycolysis. Here we go, let's make some ATP. Okay, so those are our two storage sites. When I say fat, what I really mean is going to be things we're going to call free fatty acids, okay, which is how it's going to appear in the blood. But generally, when we talk about fat tissue, you're going to have some in your blood from whatever it is that you eat. But the storage sites are going to be adipose tissue, so subcutaneous adipose tissue. You also have fat in the muscle. You also have fat in the liver. It's not great to have fat in your liver, predisposes you to type 2 diabetes. Okay. But the big thing here, the big thing between these two deals. One, a molecule, a free fatty acid has way more potential energy in it than a molecule of glucose. And you have way more adipose tissue, even in people that have essentially none. Okay. Very, very low body fat levels, you still have way more adipose tissue than you do muscle and liver glycogen. So our capacity to store energy is very, very high with fat. Okay, it's very high. That's good, but it's a problem because we can't use all of that for exercise. Some interesting kind of interactions that go on. Okay. Then there's protein. Proteins are made up of amino acids. In a lot of instances, if you need to metabolize protein, you send the protein to the liver and through a process called gluconeogenesis, you convert protein and amino acids in the liver into glucose. And then you can break the glucose down. Okay. Generally, we only use protein as a metabolic substrate if you're in a relatively severe caloric deficit. Okay. This is our last resort kind of thing. Because what happens is, where is the protein in your body? If you don't eat the protein, where is protein in your body? Muscle. Okay. The body wants to preserve muscle. So it will only break down muscle when we tend to be in a negative caloric balance. And this has some really interesting applications for exercise, for recovery from exercise, for people attempting to alter their body composition while also maintaining muscle mass and different types of things that we will cover when we get into body composition later in class. Okay? But that's there. Now, in other instances, if all you do is eat protein, okay, there are diets where you do this, then that can shift things around a little bit, right? So if you never eat carbs, then you're going to make some carbs by taking all that protein that you're eating and converting it into glucose. So there's some interesting things that go along if you do keto or you do Atkins or something like that, or whatever we're calling it these days, carnivore, right? Where you go out and like tackle a deer and eat it raw or whatever. I don't really understand what some of those things are. I see it on videos and things. Okay. I'm going to show you guys these terms because they all look and sound relatively similar, but they mean something ever so slightly different. And I'm going to use them as we go forward. Okay. The first one is glycolysis. Okay, glycolysis. Glycolysis is and describes a metabolic pathway where we break down glucose and we make ATP. Okay? Break down glucose to make ATP. Theoretically, and this is where it gets complicated, we're going to take the glucose, we're going to make lactic acid or lactate at the very end, and we make some. That's glycolysis. Okay? That's glycolysis. Secondly, we have a thing called glycogenesis. Genesis means to make, put together at the beginning, and how, depending upon how you want to define it. Glycogenesis is basically the ability to make glycogen from glucose. You eat extra glucose or extra carbohydrates beyond what you need, and you're going to make glycogen, both in the liver and the muscle. That's called glycogenesis. Glycogenolysis, lysis to break down, okay? Also part of glycolysis there. Glycogenolysis is when you break glycogen back down into its glucose molecules. Okay. I do want you guys to know there's one enzyme here. Okay. The primary enzyme that is responsible for breaking both liver and muscle glycogen down, so we can release the stored glucose, is an enzyme called phosphorylase. Okay. Why is it called phosphorylase? Phosphate on something, but it's just it's a weird thing. That's actually not 100%. There would be a kinases are usually what put phosphate groups on things, but it's called phosphorylase. I just need you guys to know that. Okay. When you exercise, you activate phosphorylase in your muscle. When you exercise, you activate phosphorylase, a different phosphorylase that's going to break down liver glycogen. Okay. That's glycogenolysis. And then the one that I already mentioned, which is called gluconeogenesis, it's making glucose from a non-glucose substrate, primarily amino acid protein. It occurs in the liver. If you want to know more about this, you can take biochemistry and gouge your eyes out with a spoon over all of those things. Okay. Those are some terms. This slide is simply meant to illustrate in sort of an average sized person, the capacity, right? The capacity that we have from a stored carbohydrate and fat standpoint. Okay. On the top, an average, this is like 150 or 145 pound person, has about 1,500 calories of stored carbohydrate in your body. That's glucose in your blood. That's muscle glycogen and liver glycogen. Okay, 1,500 calories. You sit on the couch and you're a 145 pound person. You probably got about a day and a half worth of just sitting there not doing anything in caloric expenditure just from carbohydrates. Okay, so you've got about enough to go about 15 miles if you were going to walk or jog. Use about 100 calories per mile if you're going to do those. Okay. So that's what's there. Now, this is a person with 12% body fat. Okay. Very, very little body fat. Right. If it's a 143 pound woman who has 12% body fat, she has essentially no body fat, like none. Okay. So 72,000 calories in fat. Okay. 72,000. Days and days and days work. That's why you can go on Survivor, and as long as they give you some water, you can basically not eat for several weeks and you will lose weight and adipose tissue, but you can survive to an extent because we have this ginormous energy store. Okay. Ginormous energy store in both subcutaneous and intermuscular fat. Most of it is subcutaneous. Okay. So we'll get into a little bit about why and how we're going to use those different kinds of things. Okay. Not only do we have more stored as fat, okay, we also actually get more ATP the more efficient process or the more rewarding process. We get about 9 kcals, okay, per gram of fat that we break down compared to 4 for protein and carbohydrate. Okay, this is going to come from where and in which process we break down fat versus carbs. Okay, it also comes from, you can look at the molecular differences there, right? Fat is generally like at C16H18O2 versus C6H12O6, which is going to be carbs. And so the makeup is going to get us a little bit more energy, but also where it enters into our metabolic pathways is going to matter. Okay. So, in an ideal world, as you guys sit here right now, you are deriving, even unless you just had like 3 Pop-Tarts or something for breakfast, which is just straight sugar, okay? You are likely at rest going to derive more of your energy to stay alive from fat than from carbohydrates. And you're going to use very, very little protein. This is because, one, you have this giant store of it, okay? So we're not in any real danger of running out. But also, when you use it, we get more sort of more ATP or more kcals per unit that we break down. Okay? That's great at rest, because the problem with fat metabolism is it's slow. It's good, we have a lot of fat, we have a lot of capacity to make energy, and we get more per molecule, but it's very, very slow. Okay? So when we do fun things, and I say everybody get up and start doing squats to wake yourselves up, sometimes you can't, you gotta use carbs rather than fat because the fat's too slow. All right, so we'll get into a little bit of that today and on Wednesday. Okay. Let's talk about our pathways now. Okay. I guess that all of you guys have seen these before, and I want you guys to know 2 things about every pathway. Okay. What goes in, and then what comes out. You don't have to memorize every step in glycolysis. You don't have to memorize every step in the Krebs cycle. You don't have to memorize all of the cytochromes and different things in the electron transport chain. I want you to know what goes in and then what comes out. Okay. I also am going to show you guys and point out some key steps, primarily the step that controls how fast the pathway can go. As you guys will see by the end of class on Wednesday, the speed of the pathway, okay, is one of the key things that determines speed of a pathway, energy yield of a pathway, kind of how we're going to use that to meet the demands we impose on the body at a given moment as to which pathway we're going to use. Okay. So we have what we call immediate metabolic pathways. They are sometimes called the phosphagen pathways. They are essentially immediate because they are one-step reactions. Okay? One-step reactions. These are very, very simple. This is like you passing your pencil to your neighbor. Okay? Your neighbor's like, "Ooh, I broke my pencil. Boom, here, give it to me." Okay? One step, very fast. As opposed to some of our other ones where it is, we're going to pass the pencil from this side of the room across everybody to get over to the other side. Okay? You get the same thing, but it takes a lot longer. And if I'm talking too fast and you need to write right now, it's much, much better if you just grab it from your neighbor. Does that analogy make sense? Okay? So, for the immediate pathways, there is the ATP you have in your muscle. You have anywhere in a cell. Stored ATP. That's the first thing you're going to use. But remember, in like a second, it's all gone. Okay? The second one of the immediate or the phosphagen pathways is the one that has the largest capacity. And that is energy stored in creatine phosphate. Okay, stored in creatine phosphate. We'll get into this reaction in just a few minutes, but generally with creatine phosphate, there's a finite amount in your muscle. If you take creatine and you supplement creatine, or you just eat like 3 cans of tuna fish a day, you can make this go up, and that may be a good thing. Okay. Then there is another pathway called the myokinase pathway. We don't use myokinase a huge amount. Okay, we use it a little bit. And I'll show you guys what that looks like. Myokinase is when you take 2 ADP molecules and you make ATP and AMP. So it's kind of it's not really a last resort, but it is another way to do this. Okay? Just so you guys understand, this anaerobic and occurs in the cytoplasm refers to all of this. Okay? I want you to know this for all of our pathways. Where do they take place in the cell? It's vitally important to know that. And do they or do they not use oxygen? All of the sort of immediate oxygen pathways occur in the cytoplasm. That helps them go faster. Okay. Cytoplasm is going to be the thing that is more closely around where the cross bridges are. Okay. So we don't have to move the ATP that we make in and out of the mitochondria or anything else. It's going to occur in much closer proximity to the place that we need it. Okay. These pathways do not use oxygen. They do not use oxygen. So we call them anaerobic. Okay. The problem with these is that there's only a finite amount. There's not enough of these to last very long. Okay. Now, the next two are going to work in concert with each other. And I'm going to say some things about glycolysis, and then I'm going to turn around and in some ways contradict myself, which I apologize for, but I will try to put it in the right context that you guys can understand. Okay? A non-oxidative or an anaerobic process that also occurs in the cytoplasm is what we call glycolytic metabolism. This is the process of breaking glucose down into lactic acid, called glycolysis. Okay? I'll show you guys all of the steps that are going to be involved in this, and I'll point out the key ones in a minute. Okay? But glucose or carbs, and we break it all the way down and we make lactic acid, and we get extra ATP. Okay? If my immediate ones, I get 1 ATP from each reaction. With glycolysis, I get 2 or I might get 3. So I get double or triple the ATP. That's good. But it's much longer. Okay? It's a multi-step reaction. Okay? It also makes something at the end. When you make lactic acid, it makes a thing at the end that may cause us some problems. Okay? May cause us problems. There's hydrogen, you put an acid in water, cytoplasm is water, it dissociates, you get hydrogen ions, they bind to chemoreceptors, and that's why your muscles spark. Those hydrogens also prevent calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. They block the function of the myosin ATPase. They block the function of cross-bridge formation. Generally, they just mess everything up. So this is good. It's a little bit slower. I get more energy, but I got problems at the end. Okay. The last pathway is what we call oxidative metabolism. This is the idea of traditional aerobic metabolism. Okay. Aerobic metabolism takes place in the mitochondria. And the end step, the last step, is going to involve oxygen. Aerobic metabolism does not work without oxygen being able to be the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Okay? And I will illustrate that for you guys in a few slides. You guys can see why. Okay? Where things get interesting is I can do glycolysis and right before the last step, rather than making lactic acid, I can take one of the second to last products of glycolysis, which is pyruvate, and I can shuttle it into the mitochondria and I can break it down in aerobic metabolism. And so then I don't make lactic acid. That's possible. Also in aerobic metabolism, this is where fat is going to be broken down. It's going to function very differently, okay, at the start, but in essence, we're going to still stick fat into the Krebs cycle and then down to the electron transport chain. So these are fast, okay, very fast, very low yield. Glycolysis is slower than this, we get more, but it causes problems at the end. And then as you can imagine, if I have to do glycolysis and then go here, or I have to take fat and do some things to it and then go here. Aerobic metabolism is the slowest metabolic process that we have. But it also generates the largest amount of energy. Okay. And it doesn't make anything that's going to cause fatigue or shut down our process. There's no sort of feedback loop in that particular way. That's the context here. That's our context. I'm going to say something right now that you guys may have never heard before. I don't know how they're teaching this in human phys now. Okay. Hopefully you got this in health and fitness or someplace. But all of you, as you sit there right now, are using every one of these metabolic pathways all the time. Okay, all the time. Every pathway is active, and every pathway is used every moment of the day. Okay? When you go from rest to exercise, you're still using all of them. Okay? All the pathways all the time. But we need to understand, and that I hope you get by the end of all of this, is this idea. One of these groups, okay, one of these groups of metabolic pathways will be the predominant energy pathway at any moment in time, okay? And which one that is going to vary based upon how much force do you need during exercise, so how much total ATP, and how long is the exercise going. And then to a lesser extent, what have you eaten and how well trained you are. But it's mostly about exercise intensity and exercise duration. Okay? Those two things are going to kind of work in concert. All right? So I will come back and we'll talk more about this, maybe not today, but at the very start on Wednesday. Okay? Are you guys with me so far? Okay, so I have a fun graph, okay? What you see in this graph, okay, is exercise time. Time on the x-axis, okay? And then on the y-axis is the relative potential energy from each of our metabolic systems that we're going to have here. And so we have a black line that's going to show the phosphagen system. And then we have two sets of dashed lines. The smaller dashes is what we're calling non-oxidative. This is glycolysis. And then the longer dashes here, this is going to be oxidative or aerobic metabolism. Okay? And what I want you all to take away from this, I'm going to show it to you now. Then we'll talk about the pathways and we'll come back and we'll talk about this again. If I am right here and I start doing squats right now, okay? I had to push a stroller around at the zoo yesterday for a minute. So I'm kind of feeling it. As I do things, right? 10 seconds, 30 seconds. As soon as I start doing things, I use that immediate phosphagen system to get this extra energy that I need right now. Okay? But there's only a finite amount. Okay? Anytime you've ever done a sprint, anytime you've ever gone to lift weights or do a wall sit or something like that, okay? You go about 15 or 20 seconds and you're done. You cannot maintain that high intensity of exercise, okay? At very, very high intensities because you've used it all up. Now, if you're walking, as I start walking, I'm using phosphagen, but my energy output, my energy demands are not that high. So I can walk and it will take me a little bit longer to use some of this up. But initially, we use the phosphagen system. Then as it begins to fall, we are immediately going to ramp up right in that kind of 30-second to 1 minute period, a reliance on glycolysis. Okay. And then after about 90 seconds to 2 minutes, it's going to also begin to lose its capacity or at least its contribution. And then aerobic metabolism is going to really take a couple of minutes and it's going to kind of kick in. Okay. So activities that you can do that last more than a couple of minutes, walking, running, whatever you're doing, you're primarily going to have to rely on aerobic metabolism to do those. That's why you can't sprint for 3 minutes. You just can't do it. Right? It's not going to happen. You cannot supply that much energy to be able to do those things. So the interaction of these three kind of things this is showing time, but it also is going to be dependent upon kind of how much ATP that you need. Okay? So we'll talk about the pathways and then we'll come back probably first thing on Wednesday and we'll hit this again. Okay? Okay. So you guys have heard of the creatine phosphate pathway before you guys talk about these nutrients, yes? Okay. So creatine phosphate is made and it exists in your muscles as a molecule of creatine with a phosphate group that has been put on it. You eat protein, you take a creatine shake or something. Putting creatine in pre-workout is dumb because it takes like a day and a half to get it in and digest to get it into your muscles and then put the phosphate on. So you need the creatine yesterday to be useful for today. It's a sort of a side note on my end. But what we got there, okay, is we load, we can increase, but it works like this. You start exercising. I start doing squats, okay? Squat, squat. I break down that stored ATP in my muscle. And as the ATP gets broken down, I have ADP that is going to be now floating around. I have that scaffolding of ADP. When that ADP encounters creatine phosphate, and it encounters there's an enzyme called creatine kinase that drives this reaction. We pull the phosphate off of creatine, hook it on to ADP, and I now have ATP that I've made back, and then just creatine that's floating around. Okay? One step, synthesized by one enzyme, and it's controlled by ADP level. Okay? Pretty much everything in metabolism is controlled by increases in ADP. Okay? But as ADP rises, then it drives this reaction to the right. Okay? This is biochemistry, or it's basic chemistry. If you have these reactions, these sort of two-way redox reactions like this, when something on the left side increases, it drives the reaction to the right. So when you increase ADP because you're beginning to use the ATP in your muscles, when this goes up, it drives the reaction that way. Okay? When you stop exercising, this is a fascinating concept. Okay? As you break down creatine phosphate, so I'm squatting, I'm using it, I'm using it, I'm using it, I'm using it, boom, and I stop. Okay? As soon as I stop, my metabolism has increased, so I'm making more ATP than I need because I've stopped doing things. Then the reaction starts going back this direction. Okay? Who said personal training? Nobody said personal training? You guys have? Okay. Billy, do you remember Joe talking about measuring 1 rep max?
Yeah.
Do you remember there's a suggestion for how long you're supposed to wait in between attempts at doing a 1 rep max? Do you remember what that time period is?
I don't remember.
You don't. Does anybody remember?
Is it 5 minutes?
It's about 5 minutes. Good bet. Okay, 5 to 6 minutes. Why did we decide on it? You just pull that number out of the air. That's enough time to check some TikToks, right? Message a couple of people, take some selfies, right? Here I am, I'm maxing out today. No. Okay. It's because after you stop exercising, okay, depending upon how much you've broken down, the half-life of making creatine phosphate back, depending upon how well trained you are, is about 45 to 90 seconds. Okay. So if for some reason you were to use all of it up in about 6 minutes, you're at about 92% to 95% replenished. Okay. The idea behind this is, if this is one of the places that I get immediate energy from, I need to wait and build it all back up. And it only gets built back up when I've stopped exercising in between minutes. Okay. Now, in a regular day, if you're going to do reps to failure, and what you really care about is failure, you wait 2 or 3 minutes, then you're not going to get all of it back, but you're going to get a reasonable amount, and that's kind of where we are. Okay. So this is a big deal. Okay. Fastest way of getting energy outside of breaking down stored ATP. This is the first pathway that we use. I start walking, I'm using creatine phosphate. You put your arm over your head, creatine phosphate. You're riding, creatine phosphate. It's the first thing that we use. Okay. The problem is, especially if energy demand is very, very high. I'm doing high intensity weights. I'm sprinting, I'm walking upstairs, whatever it is, where the energy need is very, very high. I only have enough for maybe 8, 10, maybe up to about 20 seconds. Okay? Maybe up to about 20 seconds. And then it's all gone. Okay? And then it's all gone. If you run, for most of us, anybody that ran 100 meters like in high school or anything? Okay. Mason's the sprinter. Okay. So I ran when I was in junior high, way back in the day. I was a hurdler. I ran the 110 meter hurdles. So I was reasonably fast as 15-year-olds go. Once we got a little bit older, I was not that fast, or not fast enough. World record 100 meters is like 9 seconds, like 9.6 seconds thereabouts. Good times in high school are in the low 10 seconds if you're a guy, kind of in the 12s if you're a woman. Okay, most of us, if we went and ran 100 meters right now, it might take 14, 15, 16 seconds, something like that. So it's a general rule for you guys. You have about enough creatine phosphate to let you sprint as fast as you can for about 100 meters, for about the length of a football. Okay. You can keep running after that, but you're going to slow down because this is gone. So there's not enough ATP, so you cannot break all of your cross bridges again. So you're going to start slowing down. Okay. If you look at people that run 200 meters in track, their first 100 meters is faster than their second 100 meters because they've used up their creatine phosphate. They slow down out of necessity. They're still super fast, but they're still going to slow down. They're trying as hard as they can. Metabolically, though, it's going to fall. Okay? That's where we are with all of this. So those of you guys that were going to I'm going to do push-ups for like a minute, you've used up all your creatine phosphate in about 30 seconds. Okay? And so that's why things are going to get more difficult. Anybody in Exercise Phys Lab? We don't do Wingate tests in Exercise Phys Lab, do we? Anybody in Exercise Phys Lab with Dr. Pereira or with Andrea? A couple of you guys. Victoria, are you nodding your head? Yes. Are y'all going to do what's called a Wingate test, or have you done a Wingate test? Do you know? Okay. So a Wingate test is I put you on like a spin bike, and I set the resistance to be about 70% of your body weight, and I say you have 30 seconds sprint. Go as fast and as hard as you can for 30 seconds. It may be the single worst exercise in the entire history of the world. Okay. The IRB doesn't like for us to do it here. When I was a grad student at Georgia, we would do them. Somebody's going to pass out. We would have a lab with this class. Everybody did a Wingate test. Somebody was going to pass out from doing it. It's awful. It is awful. But it's really illustrative because people are out, they're killing it, they're killing it, they're killing it. They get to about 12 seconds and then they slow down. And that back 15 seconds is the longest 15 seconds of your life. Because you're just like, I'm trying, and it won't go because you don't have any creatine phosphate. Okay? All of your stored ATP is gone. All of your creatine phosphate is gone, and you're just like, this is the worst thing I've ever done. Okay? So that's the idea behind all of this. Okay? We'll start here because this is going to be the same thing that happens in all of our reactions. But I think this is an easy way to illustrate it. Okay. Again, I don't really understand how metabolic reactions take place in real life, much less all of our other signaling pathways, but everything that happens with metabolism occurs because of random chains. Okay. It occurs because of random chains. Imagine all of you are blindfolded and you're just walking around in this room. Okay. Some of you are creatine phosphate molecules. Some of you are ADP molecules. Some of you are this enzyme called creatine kinase. And so what has to happen for a metabolic reaction to take place is I need a creatine phosphate molecule, an ADP molecule, and the enzyme, the creatine kinase enzyme, all to bump into each other at the same time. Okay? You're all blindfolded, you're all wandering around. It's like playing Marco Polo in the pool, right? And we hope that the correct three things bump into each other at the right time. And when they do, then we get this reaction. Creatine phosphate, it encounters ADP, it encounters creatine kinase. When those things happen, we pull the phosphate off, we stick it onto ADP, and then now we have ATP. Okay? Some of you are creatine phosphate molecules, you're wandering around and you're carrying your water bottle with you. You bump into the enzyme and you bump into ADP, and the enzyme takes your water bottle and it hands it to the ADP molecule, and now we have ATP. Okay? And you go on floating about your business until you can do the exact reverse reaction. Okay? It blows my mind when any kind of shit ever happens. But that's what's going on. Okay? So you can imagine when you supplement with creatine and you make more creatine phosphate in your muscle, then there's more of you guys in the room that are creatine phosphates. There's a greater chance you're going to bump into something, to the other things. Okay? If I make the enzyme level go up, there's a greater chance that we're going to bump. Conversely, as you break down ATP and ADP goes up, there's a greater chance that ADP will bump into this other. That's how all of this works. Okay? That's how all of this works. So the rate control of this reaction is driven by creatine kinase enzyme. It's a very simple one-to-one reaction. Phosphate from creatine phosphate, give it to ADP, we now have ATP. That's it. Very simple. Okay? When you stop exercising, your mitochondria spit out ATP from aerobic metabolism. And there's a creatine kinase enzyme that exists basically in the outer membrane of the mitochondria. And as free creatines float by, then the reverse reaction takes place and we make our creatine phosphate. Okay. Questions about this? You guys understand? Okay. We need to appreciate and understand the mechanics of how these reactions work, because this one is easy and simple and straightforward. Everything from now on is just going to be the same thing. There's just going to be 10, 12, 25 steps to it. So we do the first step, and then the exact same kind of random action takes place, and then another, and another, and another, and another. But biochemically, it's the same concept. We just have to go through more and more steps. Okay. Cool. I want to spend just another second talking about resynthesis, okay? I talked about this with our example of this is why we have to wait when you're lifting weights. You wait a certain amount of time between doing things. But the process of making creatine phosphate back, once it's been depleted during exercise, once you stop exercising, is also sometimes termed the creatine phosphate shuttle. The CP shuttle. Okay? We're shuttling energy out of the mitochondria and back onto creatine. We only use ATP from aerobic metabolism to resynthesize creatine phosphate. So in general, once you start exercising, you break your creatine phosphate down, you will not make any more of it, you won't make it back until you stop. Okay? Until you stop. So that's what's going on here. I'm going to show you guys a graph, okay? And this is going to illustrate what I hope is the same sort of point, okay? Don't worry about what's going on in the very top. This is just trying to show, in essence, okay, the idea of how we're transferring ATP for what we need between creatine phosphate, ADP, but then making it back here in the mitochondria. The graph on the bottom is the one I really want you guys to care about, okay? So you can visually see what this is. The x-axis is time, okay? The y-axis is the amount of creatine phosphate in a muscle. This is measured in an MRI machine, okay? Using something called magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or MRS, okay? This is not, I went and got my ACL image in some ways to see if I tore my ACL, but a lot of the machines that can do that can also do those. Okay? This line here in the middle, this dashed line, is going to represent when exercise stops. So we start off here at rest. You have some amount of creatine phosphate in your muscles. You've got all you're going to have. We then do high intensity exercise for about 30 seconds, and you will note we deplete a lot of it down to here. So my levels drop because I'm using it to make ATP. I stop exercising, and then it begins to be made back again. Okay? So there's this kind of exponential fit on resynthesizing ATP, or resynthesizing creatine phosphate. Okay? So that's what this is going to look like. You will note in the one on the right, they didn't exercise quite as long, right? The distance between here and here is larger than the distance between there and there. But note how the curves look relatively similar, but because I didn't exercise as long, or I didn't deplete quite as much, it's going to come back a little bit faster. Here's the key thing with this, the reason that I showed you guys all. Really, really, really important if you ever want to coach athletes or anything else, okay? The rate at which this is going to recover is entirely dependent upon how well your aerobic metabolism functions. So it's entirely dependent upon mitochondrial function and mitochondrial numbers. So this is an anaerobic exercise, very high intensity. If you want to recover faster between sets of lifting weights or between repeated sprints, then you need to go run and you need to make more mitochondria. You need a better aerobic metabolism. And so this is this concept of this is an interaction between aerobic metabolic function and anaerobic function, or recovery of anaerobic function. This is important if you're a basketball player, or a football player, or a soccer player. Okay? I like to think of it as football, where you do things in these little bitty short bursts, where you use a lot of creatine phosphate, and you do a quick burst, and then you get to rest for just a few seconds. Okay? And you need to be well trained aerobically, so that when you get to rest, you can recover more and more of your creatine phosphate. So the next time you have to be active, you've got more of it to be able to use right now. More to be able to use right now. So even if your sport relies upon anaerobic metabolism, high force levels very fast, it may be very useful for you to also be a highly trained aerobic athlete. Okay? So football players need to go run. Basketball players need to go run, right? Do things to increase their aerobic metabolism. It's going to help them recover better in between plays or in between things. This is one. Okay. Questions? Okay. Myokinase reaction. It's basically the same thing as the creatine phosphate reaction. It's just that we're going to use an enzyme called myokinase, and we're going to pull a phosphate off of ADP, stick it on to another ADP molecule, so we're going to end up with ATP and adenosine monophosphate. Okay, so it's the same idea. It's a one-step reaction. We don't do a lot of this. We don't do it a lot, but we do get some energy from doing all of this. Okay, it's less advantageous for us to have adenosine monophosphate floating around than ADP. So it takes us longer for us to recover. But those are going to be. That's the myokinase. Okay. So every time you do something, you're going to get a little bit of energy from there as well. Okay. So you don't have to know these numbers precisely, but I like the chart because I think it illustrates sort of the potential anaerobic energy available from these immediate energy sources. Okay. You will note here that we're talking about what we're calling useful energy in kcals or calories per kilogram of muscle mass or per kilogram of total muscle mass. So we're trying to normalize this among people that have different size muscles. Okay. But floating around in your muscles, you've got about 1.8 arbitrary units of ATP. You've got a little bit more than about 4 times that much creatine phosphate. Okay. You have about 1, so even less myokinase equivalent than we have stored ATP. So even though we can do the reaction, we get a little bit, there's not very much. And so then all of this added together gives us whatever our kind of total capacity to generate this immediate energy from kind of these one-to-one reactions to be able to make ATP. Okay. And so if I told you that you use up most of your stored ATP within 1 or 2 contractions, then that has happened. We've got about 1 more contraction worth of myokinase, and then 4 or 5 contractions worth of creatine phosphate. And that gets us to our, right, like 15 to 20 seconds. Okay. You don't have to know the numbers. I just like the idea that it kind of illustrates the relative ability and relative contributions that each of these things can make for us. Okay. All right. Some of you may be wondering, I'll tell the people that are on, tell the people on Zoom this as well. We've not gone far enough to be able to be ready to take the quiz. Okay. We need to get through glycolysis to do the quiz. So we're not going to quiz today, even though the quiz is open. Okay. I'm going to reset the quiz for Wednesday. I'll reset it for Wednesday. We'll still do it at the end of class on Wednesday. So it's going to go through. It's going to time out. It's going to give you a 0 or I didn't take it. Don't worry about it. I will fix all of that. Okay. If you started it and you missed something or whatever, it's fine. I don't care if you've seen the questions. Not a big deal. I'm just going to reset everybody's quiz. Okay. All right. So same thing. Okay. This is basically that same chart, but I'm going to show it to you now as to where are we getting energy immediately based upon exercise intensity or total force contribution. Okay, so this is effort as a percentage of VO2 max. So we're here, we're at like 35%. So this is walking. This is jogging relatively briskly in the middle, and then 90% of VO2. This is not quite an all-out sprint, but it's going very, very fast. Okay. And so remember, I mentioned earlier that the pathways that we use is based upon availability and speed of the pathway, but also the demand for energy based on tasks that I do. So if I'm just walking, my energy demand is much lower than my energy demand from speed or from running very fast. Okay. And so at rest, when you're walking, the other pathways are the glycolysis and aerobic pathways that are also providing energy all at the same time. I don't have to use a whole lot of immediate energy when I'm walking. You don't use a whole lot to just kind of sit there and not do much. I use more when I'm jogging, but it really becomes kind of a limiting factor when I'm going very, very fast. Force production is really high. Demand is really high, so it cannot be met by glycolysis. It cannot be met by aerobic metabolism. We have to use more and more of these. Okay? That's just kind of the illustrative part. We'll revisit this, okay? We'll revisit this at the end after we talked about glycolysis, after we talked about aerobic metabolism. Okay? Okay. Now things get weird. Now things get tricky with 5 minutes left in class. Okay. So we're going to talk of glycolysis as sort of this tricky pathway. It's not really a tricky pathway, except for the very, very end. Okay. So at its most basic, glycolysis is the process of breaking down glucose, okay, into lactic acid, and we couple that with making some ATP. Okay. It occurs in the cytoplasm. There's 11 or 12 steps to it, so it takes a little bit longer, but we get twice the energy. Okay. We either get 2 or 3 ATP from this, and the reason that matters is it's all about where does the glucose come from. Okay. Where does the glucose come from? If the glucose that goes into glycolysis comes from muscle glycogen, we skip the first step in the pathway that I'm going to show you in the next slide. By skipping that step, it saves us an ATP. It saves us an ATP input. So we get 3 ATP if we use muscle glycogen. So in some ways, it's preferable if we use muscle glycogen. If we use glucose that is brought into a muscle from the blood, so it's either glucose that's come from something you've eaten, or it's glucose that has come from gluconeogenesis or from the breakdown of liver glycogen. So it all ends up with glucose in the blood. We get 2 ATP. We do the very, very first step, so it costs us an extra. The beginning of the process costs us a little bit more. Things to remember. It's a slower reaction because there's many steps. We're passing something from this side of the room through all of you guys all the way over to the other side of the room. So it takes longer, but we get more energy. And I already talked about that if we make lactic acid, we make hydrogen, pH falls, we become acidic, and that does bad things for our ability to continue to run metabolism and to contract our muscles. Okay. So there's some give and take at the end of all of that. All right, this will be the last thing that I show you guys today. So a picture from my biochemistry book before I burned it. So what you see here is something called the Embden-Meyerhof pathway. This is glycolysis minus the very last step. Okay. We see glucose at the top. Okay. And we're going to metabolize or break that glucose down until we get pyruvate. So that's what I want you to know about glycolysis. Glucose goes in, pyruvate comes out at the end. Okay. Glucose to pyruvate. You don't have to know any of the steps in between, or you don't have to know the names of any of the steps in between. The steps are important. You have to know them. Okay. Who remembers how many carbons does glucose have? 6. Pyruvate has 3 carbons. You start with a 6-carbon molecule. We're going to do some things to it, and then it's going to get into the middle here, and we're going to break it in half. Okay. And end up with 2 3-carbon molecules of pyruvate. So the very first step, and I want you to know this first step and then the third step because of the enzymes that are involved. The very first step, if glucose comes from the bloodstream, okay, we bring the glucose in and we use an enzyme called hexokinase that is going to use ATP, grab a phosphate from ATP, and hook that phosphate onto glucose. So we make something called glucose 6-phosphate, which you don't have to know. Okay. But the first step is driven by hexokinase, and putting that phosphate on glucose traps it. It's stuck in the muscle cell. Okay. It's stuck in the muscle cell. That's good. It can't get back out. But we put some energy in. Next, we're going to go from glucose 6 to fructose 6, okay? And then we're going to put another phosphate on it. We're going to make fructose 1,6-bis or biphosphate. This third step, where we put the second phosphate on, is the slowest step in this reaction. Hence, it's called the rate-limiting step. Okay? The rate-limiting step in glycolysis is driven by an enzyme that I want you guys to know called phosphofructokinase. Phosphofructokinase. You will see it abbreviated as PFK. Okay? So because this is the slowest step, it's this step that limits basically size of the doorway to allow things to be able to kind of on the glucose side to get us down to the pyruvate or lactic acid side. So this is the rate limiting step. But you guys will note we've put 2 ATP in, okay? So far the reaction has cost us 2 ATP. We then split it, we start breaking it down, and then we get an ATP and an ATP, but we've got 2 phosphates, so we're actually going to get 2 and 2. So we make 4. 2 go in, 4 come out, so we've netted 2 ATP. Okay. We've also done some things with some electrons here that I will talk about. Okay. All right. If you owe me a task, I need analysis. We'll see you guys on Wednesday.